September 1, 1939. At 4:45 in the morning, the people of Poland were still asleep. There was no official declaration, no final warning, no last diplomatic message, only the thunder of guns. From the Baltic Sea, the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on a small Polish garrison at Westerplatte. Within minutes, bombs began falling from the sky. German troops crossed the border from 3 directions. Tanks rolled. Planes screamed overhead. Civilians ran in confusion. And in that single moment, Europe tipped into chaos. This was not just an invasion. This was the decision that ignited the deadliest conflict in human history, World War II. But here's the question most people never stop to ask. Why did Germany risk another catastrophic war only 21 years after the devastation of World War I? Why did Adolf Hitler choose Poland as the spark? And why did Britain and France finally decide, this time, they would not back down? Because this invasion was not sudden. It was calculated. It was prepared. And it was staged. In fact, on the night before the invasion, German operatives dressed in Polish uniforms attacked their own radio station near the border. They broadcast anti-German messages in Polish, then left behind dead bodies dressed as Polish soldiers. The next morning, Hitler stood before the Reichstag and declared, "Poland has attacked us." It was a lie. But it was the lie he needed. Behind the speeches, behind the tanks, behind the flags and marching soldiers, there was a strategy years in the making. Germany had been rebuilding its military in secret. Factories were running day and night. Young men were being trained. New tactics, lightning-fast, overwhelming assaults, were ready to be unleashed. And Poland was about to become the testing ground. But here's what makes this story even darker. Hitler did not act alone. Just 1 week before the invasion, Nazi Germany signed a shocking pact with its ideological enemy, the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin. The world could not believe it. 2 dictators who publicly hated each other, suddenly agreeing not only to stay neutral, but secretly to divide Poland between them. Poland was already doomed. And when German forces struck from the west, the Soviets would strike from the east. It was a trap. A nation caught between 2 predators. But perhaps the biggest miscalculation of all was this. Hitler believed Britain and France would protest, but do nothing. He thought they would hesitate again, just as they had when he remilitarized the Rhineland, annexed Austria, and dismantled Czechoslovakia. He believed the world lacked the courage to stop him. He was wrong. Within 48 hours of the invasion, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The local conflict became a global one. The invasion of Poland lasted just over a month. But the war it unleashed would last 6 years, consume continents, and kill more than 70 million people. All because of one decision, one order, one early morning bombardment. So what truly drove Germany to invade Poland? Was it revenge for the Treaty of Versailles? Was it economic desperation? Was it ideology? Or was it pure ambition? To understand the invasion, we must go back. Back to humiliation. Back to anger. Back to a broken Germany searching for redemption. This is the story of how Europe slid from uneasy peace into total war. To understand why Germany invaded Poland in 1939, we have to go back to 1919. Back to a defeated empire. Back to a document that many Germans would come to hate more than any battlefield loss. The Treaty of Versailles. After World War I, Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war. It lost territory. It lost colonies. Its army was reduced to just 100,000 men. Tanks were banned. Aircraft were banned. Submarines were banned. The Rhineland was demilitarized. And on top of it all, Germany was ordered to pay enormous war reparations. To many Germans, this wasn't peace. It was humiliation. Veterans returned home not as heroes, but as defeated men. The economy collapsed under the weight of debt. Hyperinflation in the early 1920s wiped out savings overnight. Middle-class families watched their life savings become worthless paper. Anger began to grow. And anger needs a voice. That voice would become Adolf Hitler. Hitler did not invent German resentment. He weaponized it. He spoke of betrayal, claiming Germany had not truly lost World War I on the battlefield, but had been stabbed in the back by politicians, Jews, and Marxists. He promised to restore pride, to rebuild the military, to reclaim lost lands, to unite all ethnic Germans under one Reich. Most importantly, he promised to tear up the Treaty of Versailles. When he became chancellor in 1933, many foreign leaders underestimated him. They saw a loud extremist leading a fragile government. They did not yet see a man preparing Europe for war. Almost immediately, Germany began rearming, secretly at first, then openly. Factories produced weapons in violation of the treaty. Young men joined new military training programs. In 1935, Hitler announced the creation of the Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, and reinstated conscription. Britain and France protested. But they did nothing. That silence sent a message. In 1936, Hitler marched German troops into the Rhineland, a zone that had been forbidden for military forces. It was a massive gamble. German generals warned him. If France responded militarily, Germany would have to retreat. France did not respond. Again, no war. Again, no consequences. Hitler learned something critical in those moments. The Western powers feared another war more than they feared him. And he intended to use that fear. Next came Austria. In 1938, German troops crossed the border and annexed the country in what became known as the Anschluss. Many Austrians welcomed them. Hitler declared it the unification of all German people. Britain and France protested again. But once more they did nothing. Then came Czechoslovakia. Hitler demanded control of the Sudetenland, a region with a large ethnic German population. European leaders gathered in Munich to negotiate. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain believed he could preserve peace by giving Hitler what he wanted. The Munich Agreement handed over the Sudetenland without a fight. Chamberlain returned to Britain declaring, "Peace for our time." Within 6 months, Hitler took the rest of Czechoslovakia anyway. By now, a pattern was clear. Each move was bolder than the last. Each time, the response from Britain and France was hesitation. Each time, Hitler grew more confident. But Poland was different. Poland had something Hitler desperately wanted: access to the Baltic Sea and control of the Polish corridor, land that separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany. The city of Danzig, largely German in population, was under League of Nations protection. Hitler demanded its return. Poland refused. This time, Britain and France made a promise. In March 1939, they guaranteed Poland's independence. If Germany invaded, they would declare war. Hitler was furious. But he also believed they were bluffing. After all, they had backed down every time before. And behind the scenes, he was preparing something far more dangerous than territorial adjustment. He was preparing for total war. The German military had developed a new strategy: Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Instead of slow trench warfare like World War I, Germany would use fast-moving tanks, coordinated airstrikes, and rapid infantry advances to overwhelm the enemy before they could react. Speed would be the weapon. Shock would be the tool. Poland would be the first test. But there was still one major obstacle. Germany could not afford a two-front war. In World War I, fighting both France in the west and Russia in the east had been disastrous. Hitler needed to secure his eastern border before attacking Poland. The solution shocked the world. On August 23, 1939, Germany signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Publicly, the two nations agreed not to attack each other. Secretly, they agreed to divide Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland would be split between them. It was one of the most cynical agreements in modern history. Two dictators who despised each other ideologically, now partners in carving up a nation. With the Soviet threat neutralized, Hitler's path was clear. The only question left was timing. And the clock was already ticking. By late August 1939, Europe was holding its breath. Diplomats were still talking. Messages were still being exchanged. There was still, at least on paper, a chance for peace. But inside Germany, the decision had already been made. Adolf Hitler had set the date, September 1st. The German military machine was ready. Over 1.5 million soldiers were positioned along the Polish border. Nearly 3,000 tanks stood prepared. More than 2,000 aircraft waited for the signal. The invasion plan was precise. Germany would strike from 3 directions: from the north, East Prussia, from the west, and from the south through Slovakia. The goal was simple: surround and crush Polish forces before they could fully mobilize. But Hitler wanted something more than military readiness. He wanted justification. He knew Britain and France had guaranteed Poland's independence. If Germany appeared to be the clear aggressor, war with the West would be immediate. So he needed a pretext. On the night of August 31, 1939, German SS operatives carried out what would later be known as the Gleiwitz Incident. Disguised in Polish uniforms, they stormed a German radio station near the border town of Gleiwitz. They broadcast a short anti-German message in Polish. Then they left behind the body of a murdered prisoner, dressed to look like a Polish attacker. It was staged. A fabrication. a performance meant for headlines. The next morning, Hitler stood before the Reichstag and declared that Polish forces had attacked German territory. Germany, he claimed, was merely defending itself. It was a lie carefully prepared. At 4:45 a.m., the bombardment began. The battleship Schleswig-Holstein fired on the Polish military depot at Westerplatte. German bombers struck airfields, railways, and cities. Tanks rolled across the border in coordinated waves. Blitzkrieg had begun. Polish forces were brave, but they were outmatched. Their army still relied heavily on infantry and cavalry. Their air force was small and quickly overwhelmed. Communications were disrupted within hours. German armored divisions punched through defensive lines, bypassing strongholds and cutting supply routes. Instead of fighting every position, they surrounded them, isolating entire Polish units. Within days, chaos spread. Refugees flooded the roads. Civilians were caught between advancing armies. Entire towns were bombed without warning. Yet Poland did not collapse immediately. Resistance was fierce in many regions. Polish soldiers fought desperately in battles like the defense of Westerplatte and the Battle of Bzura. But Germany's speed and coordination proved devastating. Then, on September 17, the second blow fell. From the east, the Soviet Union invaded. Under orders from Joseph Stalin, Red Army forces crossed the Polish border, claiming they were protecting Ukrainian and Belarusian minorities. In reality, they were executing the secret terms of the pact signed just weeks earlier. Poland was now trapped between two invading powers. The outcome was no longer in doubt. Warsaw held out under siege until September 27. Bombarded relentlessly from air and artillery, the city finally surrendered. By early October, organized Polish resistance ended. Poland had been erased from the map. But while German troops celebrated quick victory, a much larger storm was gathering in the west. On September 3, 1939, just 2 days after the invasion began, Britain delivered an ultimatum to Germany: withdraw from Poland, or face war. Hitler assumed it was another bluff. He was wrong. At 11 a.m., British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain announced that Britain was at war with Germany. Hours later, France declared war as well. What Hitler had hoped would be a localized campaign had become something far greater. The invasion of Poland had triggered a global conflict. Yet strangely, in the weeks that followed, there was little fighting in Western Europe. This period would later be called the Phony War. Armies mobilized, but major offensives did not immediately begin. Still, the line had been crossed. Diplomacy was over. The gamble had escalated beyond control. Germany had achieved a rapid military victory. But it had awakened powerful enemies. And the war that followed would be unlike anything the world had ever seen. The gamble that changed everything. When Poland fell in October 1939, many in Germany celebrated. The campaign had lasted barely 5 weeks. Blitzkrieg had worked exactly as planned. Casualties were far lower than in the trench warfare of World War I. German propaganda declared it a masterpiece of modern military strategy. Newspapers praised the speed, the coordination, the unstoppable Wehrmacht. To many Germans it felt like redemption. But behind the victory parades, something far more dangerous was unfolding. Adolf Hitler had won the battle he wanted. He had not expected to win the war he had just started. Hitler's greatest miscalculation was not invading Poland. It was misjudging Britain. For years, he believed Britain would never risk another continental war. He admired the British Empire. He believed the British saw Germany as a natural ally against Bolshevism. Even after Britain declared war, Hitler still hoped for negotiations. But Britain had crossed the psychological line. The repeated concessions, the Rhineland, Austria, Czechoslovakia, had damaged British credibility. If Poland were abandoned too, Britain's word would mean nothing. For Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, this was the moment appeasement died. War was no longer avoidable. And yet, in the months immediately after Poland's defeat, Western Europe remained eerily quiet. Soldiers dug trenches along the French-German border. The British Expeditionary Force arrived in France. Civilians prepared for air raids that did not immediately come. This strange pause became known as the Phony War. But it was only a pause. Behind the silence, Germany was preparing its next move. Meanwhile, Poland itself was being dismantled. Under the secret agreement with Joseph Stalin, the country was divided. Germany occupied the western regions. The Soviet Union took the east. But occupation was not just about territory. It was about ideology. From the beginning, Hitler's war against Poland was racial and political. Nazi doctrine viewed Slavic peoples as inferior. The invasion was not only strategic, it was ideological. Mass arrests began almost immediately. Polish officers, intellectuals, and community leaders were targeted. Thousands were executed. Universities were shut down. Cultural institutions were destroyed. In the Soviet zone, Stalin carried out his own brutal campaign. In 1940, thousands of captured Polish officers were executed in what became known as the Katyn Massacre. Poland had not simply been conquered. It had been carved apart. And the violence unleashed there was a preview of what would later sweep across Europe. Yet even after declaring war, Britain and France did little to help Poland militarily. France launched a limited advance into the Saar region but quickly halted. There was no major Western offensive while Germany's forces were concentrated in Poland. For many historians, this was a critical moment. Had France launched a full-scale attack in September 1939, Germany might have faced disaster. Much of its army was in the east. Its western defenses were incomplete. But hesitation prevailed again. By the time Poland fell, the opportunity was gone. Hitler had secured his eastern flank, temporarily. And now he turned west. In April 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. In May, Blitzkrieg smashed into Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. The same lightning tactics used in Poland tore through Western Europe. Within 6 weeks, France collapsed. The British army barely escaped at Dunkirk. What began in Poland was now consuming the continent. And still, Hitler believed Britain would negotiate. Instead, Britain stood alone. The decision to invade Poland had triggered a chain reaction that no one could fully control. It strengthened Stalin's position in Eastern Europe. It unified British resolve. It demonstrated the terrifying effectiveness of modern mechanized warfare. But perhaps most importantly, it revealed something about Hitler's leadership. He thrived on risk. Each success reinforced his belief in his own instincts. Each gamble that paid off convinced him he was destined for greatness. And that confidence would soon drive him toward an even more catastrophic decision: the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. The pact with Stalin had always been temporary. It was a pause, not peace. The same agreement that allowed Germany to destroy Poland would eventually collapse into one of the largest invasions in history. But that is another chapter. In 1939, the world still did not grasp the scale of what had begun. Many believed the war might remain limited. Some hoped diplomacy might still intervene. They did not yet see the Holocaust. They did not yet see Stalingrad. They did not yet see Hiroshima. But the path to all of it began with one calculated strike against Poland. One early morning bombardment. One decision that transformed European tension into global catastrophe. The guns fell silent in Poland by the end of October 1939, but the echoes of that first strike on Westerplatte would resonate across the globe for years to come. What had started as a calculated invasion, a tactical strike to regain lost territory, a political move to secure Germany's eastern flank, had unleashed forces no one could fully control. The invasion of Poland was not just a military operation. It was the spark that ignited the deadliest war in human history, World War II. For the people of Poland, the consequences were immediate and brutal. Families were torn apart. Entire towns were occupied, looted, and burned. Polish officers and intellectuals were executed or sent to prisons and camps. Cultural treasures were destroyed. Streets that had once been filled with children playing and merchants selling their goods now echoed with the march of foreign boots, the rattle of machine guns, and the distant roar of planes overhead. Cities like Warsaw and Gdansk would bear the scars of this invasion for decades. In the east, under the secret terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Soviet Union moved in. Thousands of Polish soldiers were captured and executed in brutal massacres. Families fled or were deported. Villages became battlefields. Poland was no longer just a country on the map. It had become the testing ground for the ideologies and ambitions that would soon engulf all of Europe. But the consequences of that single decision were not limited to Poland. Across the continent, Europe watched, some in shock, some in disbelief, others in fear. Hitler had assumed that the Western powers, Britain and France, would not risk war. After all, they had appeased him repeatedly, allowing him to remilitarize the Rhineland, annex Austria, and dismantle Czechoslovakia without firing a shot. But Britain and France were different now. They had pledged to defend Poland's sovereignty, and when Germany crossed the border, that pledge was enforced. On September 3, 1939, Britain declared war. France followed. Hitler's assumption of Western weakness was shattered. Europe was plunged into full-scale war. The lightning assault that had succeeded in Poland had awakened a sleeping giant in the West. What Germany had hoped would be a localized campaign of quick victory had transformed into a global conflict that would demand years of bloodshed and sacrifice. The strategy of blitzkrieg had proven devastating in Poland. The combination of armored divisions, fast-moving infantry, and air superiority allowed German forces to overwhelm the Polish army, which was still relying heavily on outdated tactics and equipment. But speed alone could not sustain victory forever. Hitler's political and military ambitions were growing faster than his capacity to manage the territories he was conquering. The occupation of Poland would be the first of many situations where his overconfidence began to outpace his judgment, a pattern that would become tragically familiar in the years to follow. For Hitler, the fall of Poland reinforced a dangerous belief in his own infallibility. Each success, the Rhineland, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and now Poland, had taught him that the world could be manipulated with careful timing, deceit, and sheer audacity. Diplomacy could be bent, treaties ignored, and promises exploited. But this overconfidence also blinded him to the larger consequences of his actions. The invasion of Poland, while a tactical success, set into motion a chain reaction that no single leader could contain. Britain and France were now committed to war. The Soviet Union had tasted power in the East. And the United States, though still neutral, was watching events unfold with growing concern. The human cost of this invasion cannot be overstated. Civilians in Poland bore the brunt of mechanized warfare, bombings, and scorched-earth tactics. Soldiers fought bravely, often against overwhelming odds. Families were displaced, communities destroyed, and the social fabric of the nation torn apart. The invasion also marked the beginning of systematic atrocities that would escalate as the war progressed. The brutality displayed in Poland foreshadowed the horrors of the Holocaust, the executions of POWs, and the mass deportations that would define the darkest chapters of the conflict. Yet, amid the destruction, stories of resistance, bravery, and resilience emerged. Polish soldiers held out against overwhelming odds, civilians aided one another, and underground networks began forming, determined to resist occupation. These acts of courage would inspire generations, even as the world around them descended into chaos. The invasion of Poland was a story not only of destruction but of human resilience, a testament to the will to survive in the face of unimaginable adversity. Strategically, the invasion reshaped Europe's political and military landscape. Germany now controlled the western regions of Poland, while the Soviet Union took the east. Borders were redrawn overnight. Armies were repositioned. The stage was set for further conflict in the Balkans, Scandinavia, and ultimately across the entire continent. The invasion demonstrated the effectiveness of blitzkrieg, but it also revealed the limitations of a strategy that relied so heavily on speed and surprise. Poland's occupation was only the beginning. The larger war that would engulf Europe required more resources, more coordination, and would demand sacrifices far greater than anyone could have anticipated. The decision to invade Poland was also a turning point in world diplomacy. The era of appeasement, so evident during the Munich Agreement, was over. Western democracies could no longer ignore Hitler's ambitions. The invasion forced them to confront the reality that totalitarian regimes would not stop until checked by force. It reshaped international alliances, solidified commitments to collective defense, and ultimately set the stage for the global scale of World War II. For historians, the invasion is a case study in miscalculation and overconfidence. Hitler had underestimated the resolve of Britain and France. He had assumed the Western powers would avoid conflict at all costs, just as they had during earlier territorial expansions. He had also underestimated the consequences of inviting the Soviet Union into Eastern Europe, creating a volatile dynamic that would later explode during Operation Barbarossa. Yet in his mind, each gamble seemed rational, each risk calculated. But history would prove otherwise. The invasion of Poland also demonstrated the terrifying potential of modern warfare. Tanks, planes, and mechanized infantry could achieve results unimaginable just decades earlier. Cities could be destroyed, armies decimated, and entire populations displaced in a matter of weeks. The lessons learned in Poland would be applied again and again, for better or worse, as the war expanded across the continent. Military academies would study the campaign for decades, analyzing the tactics, the speed, and the coordination that defined blitzkrieg. But the human suffering behind those lessons remains immeasurable. As Europe descended into war, the consequences of that single decision, the decision to invade Poland, would ripple across the globe. Millions would die. Cities would be reduced to rubble. Economies would collapse. Families would be torn apart. And yet, amid the darkness, human resilience would shine. Resistance movements, underground networks, and acts of defiance would persist in occupied territories. Stories of bravery, ingenuity, and survival would emerge, reminding the world that even in the face of overwhelming odds, humanity endures. In the end, the invasion of Poland was not merely the start of a military campaign. It was the ignition of a global conflict that would redefine the 20th century. It revealed the dangers of unchecked ambition, the costs of underestimating adversaries, and the human price of war. It forced nations to confront the realities of totalitarian aggression and reshaped international relations for decades to come. And it serves as a reminder that decisions made in the halls of power, in the quiet hours before dawn, can echo through history in ways that no one can fully predict. So when we look back at that early morning of September 1, 1939, we see more than tanks and bombs. We see a world on the brink, a leader blinded by ambition, a nation caught between giants, and a chain reaction that would engulf the globe. The invasion of Poland was a spark, but it was also a warning. When power is pursued without limits and when diplomacy is ignored in favor of deception, the consequences can be catastrophic. History remembers the invasion of Poland not only for the battles fought but for the lessons it imparts. Courage and resilience coexist with ambition and hubris. Strategic genius is shadowed by moral failure. And the echoes of September 1, 1939, remind us that the choices of a few can change the lives of millions. The story of Poland in 1939 is a story of humanity at its most vulnerable, and yet, at its most determined. It is a story of war's beginning, but also a story of the human spirit. A reminder that even in the darkest hours, people resist, endure, and fight for a future free from tyranny. And as we remember those first bombs falling on Westerplatte, we honor both the tragedy and the courage that shaped the world we live in today.